In 1513, they came for him in the dead of night, dragged from his bed, thrown into a dungeon, tortured for 3 weeks straight. His crime? Having his name on a list, not for plotting against the Medici family, not for leading a rebellion, simply for existing as someone they couldn't control. And in that cell, broken and bleeding, Niccolò Machiavelli learned something that would change the way power operates forever. Most people think Machiavelli was about brute force, about crushing enemies with violence and intimidation. But that's the surface reading. The real Machiavelli, the one forged in torture and exile, understood something far more dangerous. The most devastating victories happen in complete silence. Your enemies destroy themselves while you remain perfectly still. This isn't about being cruel. It's about being invisible, because the moment your opponent realizes they're being maneuvered, you've already lost half your advantage. Machiavelli didn't just survive his enemies. He studied them. He dissected their psychology. He learned to move through political battlefields like smoke through a room. Present everywhere, touchable nowhere. And what he discovered in those dark years of exile would become the blueprint for silent domination that kings, presidents, and power brokers still use today. Not through force, not through threats, through something far more unsettling, through the art of making people defeat themselves. You see, there's a reason Machiavelli's name still makes people uncomfortable 500 years later. It's not because he advocated for cruelty. It's because he revealed how power actually works when no one's watching. How the most dangerous moves happen in broad daylight, disguised as friendship. How you can destroy someone's position without them ever knowing you were involved. Most people fight their enemies head on. They argue. They compete. They try to prove they're stronger, smarter, more deserving. But Machiavelli learned something in that prison cell that changed everything. The strongest response to hostility isn't resistance, it's redirection. You don't block the punch. You step aside and let your opponent's momentum carry them off a cliff. This is why his methods feel so unsettling, because they work through patience, not passion. Through observation, not action. Through silence that speaks louder than any declaration of war ever could. When Machiavelli wanted to neutralize an enemy, he didn't attack them. He created conditions where they would attack themselves. Let me show you exactly how this works, because once you understand Machiavelli's true method, you'll start seeing it everywhere. In politics, in business, in social dynamics, in every situation where power shifts hands without a single shot being fired. The first principle Machiavelli discovered is this: your enemy's greatest weakness is their need to be seen as strong. Most people telegraph their moves because they want credit for their or her cleverness. They want others to know how strategic they are. They want recognition for their victories. And that need for visibility becomes the crack in their armor. Machiavelli learned to exploit this by becoming unreadable, not mysterious in an obvious way, not dramatically silent, just consistently unpredictable in his responses. When enemies expected anger, he showed curiosity. When they expected retaliation, he showed indifference. When they expected him to defend himself, he simply observed them with the calm attention of someone studying an interesting insect. This drove his opponents insane. Because humans are wired to read reactions. We need to know where we stand. We need feedback to calibrate our next move. But when someone refuses to give you that feedback, when they remain perfectly composed while you escalate, something psychological happens. You start doubting your own position. Think about the last time someone stayed completely calm while you were getting emotional. How did it make you feel? Probably like you were overreacting. Like maybe you were wrong. Like maybe they knew something you didn't. That's not an accident. That's psychological warfare. But Machiavelli took this further. He didn't just withhold reactions. he collected information. Every time someone tried to provoke him, he learned something about their triggers, their insecurities, their tactics. He turned every attack into intelligence gathering, and then, when the moment was right, he would use that intelligence not to destroy them, but to make them destroy themselves. Here's where it gets truly dangerous. Machiavelli understood that the most powerful manipulation doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like the other person's idea. So instead of opposing his enemies directly, he would create situations where their own worst instincts would work against them. If someone was arrogant, he would give them just enough rope to hang themselves publicly. If someone was paranoid, he would let their suspicions turn them against their own allies. If someone was greedy, he would present opportunities that looked profitable but carried hidden costs. He never forced anyone to make bad decisions. He just made bad decisions look appealing to people already inclined toward them. This is why Machiavelli's approach was so effective. He didn't fight human nature. He collaborated with it. He understood that most people are their own worst enemies. They just need the right conditions to prove it. The second principle is even more chilling. Information is a weapon, but only when your opponent doesn't know you have it. Machiavelli became obsessed with gathering intelligence, not through spies or elaborate schemes, but through simple observation. He watched how people behaved when they thought no one important was paying attention. He listened to how they spoke about others when those others weren't present. He noticed the small contradictions between their public positions and their private actions. Most people collect information to use it immediately. They hear gossip and spread it. They discover someone's weakness and exploit it right away. But Machiavelli understood that information has a shelf life. Use it too early, and you waste its potential. Use it too late, and it becomes irrelevant. But use it at exactly the right moment, and it becomes devastating. He would sit on compromising information for months, sometimes years, watching, waiting, letting his enemies grow comfortable, letting them forget that he might know their secrets. And then, when they were most vulnerable, when they had overextended themselves or made too many enemies, he would deploy that information with surgical precision. But here's the key. He never used it as a direct attack. He would let the information surface through other channels. He would create situations where his enemies' secrets would become relevant to conversations they couldn't avoid. He would make their private contradictions become public problems. And through it all, his hands would remain completely clean. This is what made Machiavelli so dangerous. He could destroy someone's reputation, their alliances, their entire position, and they would never be able to trace it back to him. Because technically, he hadn't done anything. He had simply created conditions where the truth became inconvenient for people who had been living lies. The third principle cuts even deeper. The most effective attacks come from your enemy's own allies. Machiavelli understood that every coalition contains the seeds of its own destruction. Every alliance has internal tensions. Every group has members who feel undervalued, overlooked, or betrayed. And those internal fractures are far more powerful than any external pressure you could apply. So instead of attacking his enemies directly, Machiavelli would identify the weak points in their support systems. He would find the ally who felt unappreciated, the subordinate who harbored ambitions, the partner who suspected they were being used, and then, without ever appearing to recruit them, he would create opportunities for their natural resentments to flourish. This wasn't about turning people against each other through lies or manipulation. It was about revealing truths that were already there, about giving people permission to act on doubts they already harbored, about providing just enough encouragement for natural conflicts to escalate into open warfare. The beauty of this approach is that it's completely invisible. When someone's own allies turn against them, it looks like internal politics. It looks like natural consequences. It looks like anything except what it actually is: carefully orchestrated psychological warfare. And the target of this warfare never sees it coming, because they're too focused on external threats to notice the knife being sharpened by someone they trust. They're too busy watching their obvious enemies to pay attention to the ally who's been collecting grievances and waiting for the right moment to strike. This is how Machiavelli learned to win wars without fighting battles, how he learned to eliminate threats without creating enemies, how he learned to reshape entire political landscapes through moves so subtle that historians still debate whether they were intentional or accidental. But there's one more layer to this, something even more unsettling than the tactics themselves, because the real genius of Machiavelli's approach wasn't just that it worked, it was that it was completely sustainable. When you destroy enemies through force, you create martyrs. When you destroy them through manipulation, you create suspicion. But when you create conditions where they destroy themselves, you create nothing but natural consequences. Nobody blames you for what your enemies do to themselves. Nobody sees your hand in their downfall, because your hand was never visible. You become like a force of nature, inevitable, but never obvious. And that invisibility becomes your greatest protection. Because here's what most people don't understand about power. The moment you're seen as the cause of someone's destruction, you become a target for everyone else who fears they might be next. But when destruction appears to come from natural causes, from poor decisions, from internal conflicts, nobody fears you. They just learn to respect you. Machiavelli discovered this during his years observing Cesare Borgia, one of the most brutal and effective rulers of Renaissance Italy. But Borgia's genius wasn't in his cruelty. It was in his timing, in his ability to make his enemies believe they were making their own choices, right up until the moment those choices destroyed them. The Senigallia deception remains one of the most perfect examples of silent elimination ever recorded. Borgia's own generals had turned against him. They were plotting his assassination. They had allied with his enemies. By every conventional measure, he should have been finished. But instead of fleeing or fighting, Borgia did something that seemed insane at the time. He invited them to a reconciliation meeting. These were men who wanted him dead, men who had been actively working to destroy him. And he sent them gifts. He wrote them letters expressing his desire for peace. He offered them pardons, new positions, fresh starts, and one by one, despite everything they knew about his character, they accepted his invitation. Why? Because Borgia understood something about human psychology that most people miss. Even people who hate you want to believe you can change. Even enemies prefer reconciliation to continued warfare. Even the most suspicious minds can be lulled by the prospect of an easy victory. So they came to Senigallia. All of them, his greatest threats, gathered in one place, thinking they were about to negotiate from a position of strength, thinking they had forced him to the table, thinking they had won without having to finish the fight. And that's when Borgia revealed his true genius. He had spent months creating conditions where his enemies would want to meet with him, where they would see value in reconciliation, where they would believe they had the advantage. He had made surrender look like victory. He had made a trap look like an opportunity. What happened next was swift and silent. The generals were arrested the moment they entered the city. By dawn, they were all dead. And Borgia's position, which had seemed hopeless just days before, was suddenly unassailable. His enemies hadn't just been eliminated. They had eliminated themselves by walking into a situation they should have avoided. But here's the most chilling part. Even after it was over, even after the bodies were discovered, many people couldn't bring themselves to blame Borgia entirely, because technically, his enemies had made their own choices. They had decided to trust him. They had decided to attend the meeting. They had decided to believe his promises. All Borgia had done was create the conditions where their natural desires would work against them. This is the essence of Machiavellian warfare. You don't force people to make bad decisions. You make bad decisions look attractive to people who are already inclined to make them. You don't create weaknesses in your enemies. You identify weaknesses that already exist and create situations where those weaknesses become fatal. Machiavelli studied this incident obsessively. He wrote about it. He analyzed it. He extracted principles from it that would guide his own approach to conflict for the rest of his life. And what he learned was this: the most dangerous person in any room is not the one making threats. It's the one making offers that sound too good to refuse, because that's how you identify people's real motivations. That's how you discover what they value more than their own safety. That's how you find the psychological buttons that, when pressed at the right moment, will cause them to override their better judgment. Everyone has a price. Everyone has a weakness. Everyone has something they want badly enough to take risks for. And the person who can identify those vulnerabilities, who can catalog them, who can wait for the perfect moment to exploit them, becomes virtually unstoppable. But this requires a different kind of patience than most people possess. It requires the ability to be hurt, insulted, threatened, attacked, and still maintain perfect composure while you gather intelligence. It requires the discipline to let opportunities pass because the timing isn't quite right. It requires the confidence to appear weak while you're actually growing stronger. Most people can't do this because most people need immediate satisfaction. They need to hit back when they're hit. They need to prove they're not weak. They need to show they can't be pushed around. But every time you react emotionally, every time you respond predictably, you give your enemies information they can use against you. Machiavelli learned to give them nothing. No reactions, no patterns, no reliable responses they could plan around. He became like water, flowing around obstacles instead of fighting them, wearing them down gradually instead of trying to break them immediately, finding the path of least resistance while maintaining unstoppable forward momentum. This is why his enemies found him so unsettling, because they could never predict what he would do next. They could never be sure whether he was friend or foe. They could never tell whether his silence meant indifference or calculation. And that uncertainty made them make mistakes. When people can't read you, they start projecting their own fears onto you. They assume you're more dangerous than you might actually be. They attribute more planning to your actions than might exist. They give you credit for moves you never made and blame you for consequences you never intended. And once that reputation is established, once people begin to see you as someone who operates on levels they don't understand, your actual power multiplies exponentially. Because now they're not just reacting to what you do, they're reacting to what they think you might do. They're defending against attacks you never planned. They're making preemptive moves against strategies that exist only in their imagination. This is how Machiavelli learned to control entire political environments without holding any official power. How he learned to influence decisions he was never part of making. How he learned to shape outcomes from positions that seemed completely powerless. The fourth principle he discovered cuts to the heart of human nature itself. People destroy themselves faster when they think they're winning. Success makes people careless. Victory makes people overconfident. The moment someone believes they have the advantage is the moment they stop watching for threats. So instead of trying to defeat his enemies when they were desperate and dangerous, Machiavelli learned to let them think they were succeeding. He would appear to retreat. He would seem to concede points. He would make them feel like their strategies were working, their plans were succeeding, their victory was inevitable. And then, when they were most confident, when they had relaxed their guard, when they had overextended themselves in pursuit of what seemed like an easy finish, he would reveal that everything they thought they knew was wrong. That their apparent advantages were actually vulnerabilities. That their moment of triumph was actually the moment of their destruction. This is psychological warfare at its most sophisticated, because it doesn't just defeat enemies, it breaks them. When someone discovers that their greatest victory was actually their greatest mistake, when they realize that their moment of confidence was the moment they sealed their own fate, something inside them shatters that never quite heals. They don't just lose. They lose faith in their own judgment. They begin to question every decision. They become paralyzed by doubt. And a paralyzed enemy is more valuable than a dead one, because they remain as a warning to others while posing no real threat to you. But there's something even deeper happening here. Something that reveals why Machiavelli's methods have remained relevant for 5 centuries. Because what he really discovered wasn't just how to defeat enemies. He discovered how power actually flows in human societies, how influence really works, how change actually happens. And what he found was this: the people who shape the world are rarely the ones standing in the spotlight. They're the ones who understand how to make the people in the spotlight dance to music only they can hear.